Hi guys, welcome back. We're now solving October-November 2025 paper 34. Without wasting any time, let's get started. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and press the bell icon so that whenever I post the videos, you get those notifications. Question number 1, which says, what will act as a barrier to collusion between firms? Collusion, that's a nice word. Now, you have to understand that when oligopolists collude, right? Now, collusion is easier when actually firms can predict the market conditions and monitor they can actually monitor each other's behavior. Obviously, because if I am colluding with someone, then the trust element is there, but they can, at least I can monitor what he or she is doing, and he doesn't or she doesn't breaks the collusion by cheating, right? And also when the market conditions are more predictable and more stable. So if the demand is unstable, firms may find it difficult to tell whether a fall in their sales is because a rival is secretly cutting price or just because the market demand naturally fell. So it will be difficult for them to differentiate between whether the rival is undercutting the price or whether the market demand had fallen, which caused a fall in this sales. And this sort of creates uncertainty and makes collusion harder to maintain. That is why D for David should be the correct answer. Unstable demand conditions for products. That is the reason why collusion, this will act as a barrier for collusion between firms. A is wrong because the ability to detect price cuts actually supports the collusion, because if firms can easily catch cheating, then firms are less likely to break the agreement. B is also wrong because abolishing antitrust measures would make collusion easier, not harder. C is also wrong because small number of firms would usually make collusion easier since firms can monitor each other more easily. So 1D for David is the correct answer. Question number 2, the diagram shows two indifference curve I1, I2. What do these indifference curve indicates? Now, so when you're reading these options, remember that you're reading it very carefully and you're understanding every option before you just jump to conclusion. Don't just mark an answer without giving it a second thought, unless and until it's just a simple definition or something, or just the answer is just written on the face of the MCQ. Question 2, the correct answer, A is not the correct answer. It says consumers get more satisfaction on I1 from consuming. See, obviously they get more satisfaction on I2. So A is wrong because moving along the same indifference curve, by the way. So and if you go from X to Y on the same indifference curve, you get the same utility, right? So if you go along this curve, as in you consume more of X and if you consume more of X and less of Y, if you go somewhere like this along the IC, so you're getting the same utility. It gives the same satisfaction along the IC curve, right? B is incorrect as well because the statement itself is confusing. You see, it says consumers get more satisfaction on I2, which is correct. So half the statement is correct. They do get more satisfaction on I2 because on the IC map, the higher you are up on the indifference curve on the IC map, the more satisfaction utility from get. That is why consumers always want to be on the higher indifference curve. But whether they can be on the higher indifference curve or not depends upon the budget line or their budget constraint. Now, consumers get more satisfaction on I2 from consuming less of X and more of Y. Now this part is incorrect from consuming. So you see, a higher indifference curve gives more satisfaction, but not simply because consumers consume less of X and more of Y, right? So it's not that I2 is giving more satisfaction because consumer is consuming less of X and more of Y. So utility depends upon the whole combination, and every point on the IC would give you a higher, every combination on the IC would give a higher utility than I1, right? Each point on the curve represents margin. This is correct because an indifference curve shows different combinations of the two goods that give the consumer the same satisfaction. So the slope of this indifference curve represents a marginal rate of substitution. It means that how much of good Y the consumer is willing to give up to gain one more unit of X, or vice versa. How much unit of good X consumer is willing to give up to get an additional unit of Y, while keeping the utility constant because you're on the same indifference curve. So C is the correct answer. D is incorrect as well because consumers can move from a lower indifference curve to a higher indifference curve if income rises or let's say price changes. Indifference curve don't really need to cross, right? Question 3 says, what is an example of forward vertical integration? It's from the growth of firms chapter. Now, this is talking about external growth. Now, a manufacturing firm, now C is the correct answer for this, because forward vertical integration, you need to know what forward vertical integration is. It occurs when a firm merges with or it takes over a business at a later stage of production or distribution, right? So let's say a computer manufacturer is buying a retail outlet. So it's moving. So you're actually moving. The moment you buy a retail outlet, a manufacturer buys a retail outlet, you're actually moving close to the final consumer. So you are the manufacturer, but when you buy the retail outlet, you move closer to the final consumer, right? So that is why it's called forward vertical integration. The tip is for such MCQs is that you always think that you're moving close to the final consumer. If you're moving closer to the final consumer through this integration, then it's a vertical forward integration. The rest of the answer options are incorrect, and pretty simple why they're incorrect. I don't think I need to go over them. Question number 4 says the diagram shows positive, negative externalities of production and consumption. Which row shows the correct combination of production and consumption externality when economic welfare is maximized? So let's read the question again. The question is saying you have these MPC, MSC curves given. So they're asking you, okay. So if you see, firstly, they're asking you at which position would the economic welfare be maximized. So economic welfare would be maximized at the point where your marginal social benefit equals marginal social cost. This is the point where you achieve social efficiency and you maximize your social welfare. Or you can say this also maximizes allocative efficiency from the society's perspective, as for society's perspective, right? So you're maximizing society's welfare gains, right? Now the point is, and now, okay, so, and you're internalizing all the externalities if there were externalities which were not being factored into, now they're factored into. Society is maximizing all the gains and there are no welfare losses, they're all eliminated. Now the point of consideration is, so the answer option has to be either B or D. A and C are incorrect. I always tell my students, just look at the first column. Just look at any column which is very easy column for you and just eliminate, based on that column, eliminate the rest of the options. So I looked at this column. I'm not even reading these two columns for now. I just looked at the first column and I figured out that, oh, you know what, Y is the point of economic welfare maximization, the output of Y. So I eliminated A and C based on that, because all three rows have to match together. Now it has to be either B or D. Now let's look at whether the production externality is positive or negative. See, if the MSC is lower than the MPC, it means if MSC is lower than the MPC, it means that there is a positive production externality. If MSC is less than MPC, it means that it costs society less to produce than what it cost to actually produce. The private cost is more than the social cost, which means that there's a positive welfare gain or a positive externality, which is positive production externality, which is bringing the private cost down. So in terms of society, the cost to society is less than what it actually costs to produce, right? While the MSB is less than MPB, which means that there is a negative consumption externality, which means that it costs the society more to consume than what it cost the individual. So individual consumption resulting into negative externalities, that is bringing down social benefit, right? Because marginal social benefit would be the sum of marginal private benefit plus marginal external cost, right? So yeah, sorry, marginal private benefit minus, since MSB is less, right? So marginal private benefit minus marginal external cost of consumption. So it will actually bring down the social benefit. So marginal social benefit would be less than the marginal private benefit, right? Okay, so intuitively what this means is that when you consume something, let's say you're consuming cigarettes or alcohol, or I don't know, you're doing gambling stuff or all the bad stuff, so that's benefiting you. You think it's benefiting you, well, it's not. But then if you think it is, then, but for the society, it's actually causing more harmful impacts on society. So the social benefit has to be less than the marginal benefit. So the answer option for this makes it for boy. B is correct, D is wrong, because the production externality is positive while the consumption externality for this question is negative. And the position of economic welfare being maximized is point Y. Pretty simple. I mean, they're just testing. So remember that they will test you economic theory in different ways, in tabular forms and graphical forms and numerical forms, right? So it's just Got it? Question number 5. A firm has a fixed cost of $300 and can produce 2 units per hour. Okay, its total variable costs are 200 for 1 unit and 300 for 2 units. Which cost will fall by the lowest amount when the second unit is produced? Now, again, a simple question. Fixed cost, your fixed cost is how much? Your fixed cost is actually $300. Your variable cost for the first unit is $200 for 1 unit. For 2 units, it is $300. So let's say for 1 unit, let's calculate the cost for 1 unit. For 1 unit, your AFC would be fixed cost divided by output. Your AVC would be AFC. Your AVC would be variable cost upon output, and your ATC, average total cost. The reason why we are doing this is because these are the answer options given. ATC would be total cost divided by your output. So AFC would obviously be $300. It will be consistent throughout the range of output. The fixed cost in total would be consistent, but AFC would fall as output goes up. That's a property. AVC would be variable cost upon output, and variable cost is 200 divided by the variable cost is 200 divided by the output 1 unit. This would be 200 as well. And ATC would be fixed cost plus variable cost, 300 plus 200, 500 divided by 1, which is $500. For 2 units, let's calculate these for 2 units. AFC would be, how much AFC would be 300 divided by 2 units, that is 150. AVC would be again AVC, how much is the variable cost? 300 for 2 units. So average variable cost is 300. Variable cost is 300 for 2 units. So you have like 300 divided by 2. So it's 300 divided by 2 is 150. And ATC would be fixed cost plus variable cost. For 2 units, your variable cost is 300 plus the fixed cost 300. So it's like 600 upon 2 units, which is 300. So what you see is that AFC falls from 300 to 150, AVC stays constant, this ATC falls. Which cost will fall by the lowest amount when the second unit is produced? So when the second unit is produced, the which cost falls by the lowest amount, right? So AFC is actually falling 300 to 150, right? So it fell by 150. AVC fell from 200 fell to 150, which is it fell by 50. ATC was 500 and it fell to 300, it fell by 200. So the lowest amount by which the lowest cost that falls is AVC. It fell by 50. So it falls by, so C has to be the correct answer. C for Charlie. Average variable cost is that cost that falls by the lowest amount. So think, calculate, think, read it again, just ponder upon what the question is saying. You will figure out. Ultimately, maybe you don't figure it out on your first go, but ultimately you will figure out what the question is asking, right? Okay, next question. Question number 6 says, what is the most likely evidence that an economy has reached the position of Pareto optimality? Now, we need to understand the concept of Pareto optimality as given by Alfredo Pareto. So basically, Pareto optimality, as in optimality means efficiency, right? So Pareto efficiency means that your resources are allocated so efficiently that no one can actually be made better off without someone else being made worse off. Which means that in order to make someone better off, in order to make that guy better off, or in order to make him better off, you have to make someone worse off. And if you reach that situation, it means that you have achieved efficiency, because once things have been restored and once efficiency has been reached, or once an optimal situation or position has been reached, now there is no place or tendency for further improvements. So whatever improvements that had to be made have been made. And now once you reach that optimal position, now for further if you want to make any sort of improvement, which is actually not possible, but if you want to improve someone, then you have to make someone else worse off, right? So that's what Pareto efficiency is. So what you're saying is that, the answer to this question has to be D for David, and I'll before that you have to understand. So when is the most likely evidence? Full employment. But you have to understand, if there is unemployment in the economy, if there's unemployment, there's idle labor, which means that you can actually put those labor to work. And if you put them to work, you're not making anyone worse off, because let's say there are 100 jobs available, but 60 workers are without jobs. You can place them into work. You don't need to kick someone out of work to place those 60 workers into jobs, because there are more jobs available and you can place them into work, right? So there's unemployment, then there's idle labor, and that could be used to produce more output without reducing anyone else's welfare. But if all those 100 workers are employed and there are 100 jobs, now if you want to make, but if you now you want to put someone to work or make him employed, you have to make someone else unemployed for that, right? Because everyone is now employed. So when we're talking about full employment is the strongest evidence that the economy may be at Pareto optimality, right? The reason being is that the reason why I am saying this is that you have to understand, you have to you have to think of Pareto optimality as a situation where the economy is using all of its available resources in the best possible way. That's another way of explaining Pareto optimality. You see, if there are unemployed workers who are sitting at home who want jobs, it means that the economy is clearly not using all of its, labor resources efficiently. There are unemployed workers. So those workers could be employed, and, we could produce extra goods and services. And producing extra goods and services means that welfare could be improved for the economy and society, while for those workers who are employed as well, I mean, their welfare will improve as well, because now they have jobs. So society would then gain more output, and similarly those workers would earn incomes, making them better off and society better off, while nobody else would necessarily be made worse off in that situation, right? So since it is still possible to improve someone else's welfare without really hurting anyone else's, or without really hurting the welfare of the others, so we can't really say that right now the economy is not Pareto optimal in that situation. That's why we say that when we're inside the PPC, when you have idle resources, you aren't Pareto optimal. And so any improvements in Pareto efficiency, or simply Pareto improvements when we are moving closer to the PPC, is considered Pareto improvement, not Pareto efficiency. And that is why when you are on the PPC curve, right, when full employment is reached, that is why full employment is often seen as an evidence that the economy has reached Pareto optimality, since there are no idle labor resources left that could be actually be used to make society better off now, right? So got it. So that's why the answer to question number 6 has to be D for David. Question number 7, again a repeated question. I mean, usually these sort of MCQ, one question you will always find on objectives of the firms. Firm is operating at a level of output which corresponds to the point where MR is 0. So MR 0 simply means, I mean, you know what marginal revenue is. It shows the addition to total revenue from selling one more unit, right? So when MR is positive, producing more would increase total revenue. And when MR is negative, producing more would reduce total revenue. So total revenue would actually be at the maximum where, no further improvements in revenue can be made, which is a point where MR is 0. Right? So this is incorrect, but maximizing profit occurs when MC equals MR. AR equals AC is maximizing sales, or you can say growth maximization. So D for David should be the correct answer. Question number 8 says, what is the potential benefit of privatization of a country's railway service? Again, a nice question. Privatization, we know it means transferring ownership from the public sector to the private sector, right? So a possible benefit could be that the private sector firms may face stronger competitive pressures, and you'll have profit incentives, and that would encourage efficiency and better services at lower cost, right? So that would mean that option A is the right answer. Others are pretty simple, they're wrong. Higher costs pass in the form of higher prices. Higher costs and higher prices are potential disadvantages, not a benefit. Option C is also wrong, because regulation is not really a benefit of privatization itself. I mean, regulations can still exist before or after privatization, hence that is wrong as well. Option D says potential for private monopoly. That's wrong as well, because a private monopoly is actually a risk or a disadvantage, not a benefit. Question number 9 says, which of these actions illustrates equality rather than equity? Now we know what equality is. Equality means treating everyone the same, right? So when you're treating everyone the same. So equality means treating everyone the same and giving everyone the same resources or giving everyone the same opportunities regardless of their circumstances, right? But equity means treating people according to their needs, so that everyone has a fair chance to succeed, right? So for example, let's say if a government is giving every student the same scholarship to everyone irrespective of their income level, so that's equality. But if the government gives a larger scholarship to poorer students who need it more as compared to a smaller scholarship to rich students, that's equity, because poorer students need more help. That's equity, right? So in simple terms, what you're saying is that equality is about sameness while equity is about fairness, right? As far as question number 9 is concerned, if you look at option number A, that is wrong, because ramps for people with disabilities are equity. Extra support is given according to the need, so that's equity. Option C is incorrect as well. A university admission policy, option C is wrong, because giving university places to disadvantaged students is equity, not equality. Option D is incorrect, because progressive income tax system is also equity, since higher income earners pay a higher percentage to reduce income inequality. Hence, this option D is also equity, right? Which leaves us with B, which is correct, because a rice subsidy given equally to all consumers is an example of equality, because every member of the public receives the same subsidy per kilo, right? So regardless of their income or regardless of their need even, right? So that's what makes option B for boy the correct answer. Question number 10 says there is a decrease in the supply of female labor. What will be the likely effect on male and female wages? Now, a decrease in the supply of female labor would actually mean that when supply goes down, the wages will go up for female labor, right? Because fewer female workers are available. And similarly, but the thing is that when supply of female workers goes down, I mean, male labor is likely to be a substitute for female labor in a lot of jobs, right? So as female labor would become scarcer and more expensive even, so firms may start demanding more male labor instead. So this would increase the demand for male labor, and which would also increase the wages of the male labor as well. So the answer has to be increase, D for David. Got it? Question number 11. Question number 11 says, a government introduces a national minimum wage. What is not a benefit of this to the economy? Now, option A, national minimum wage is basically, we know that it's a legal minimum wage below which workers cannot be paid, and we know that it can increase the incomes of low paid workers, and it also may improve the motivation levels of and the productivity of the workers who are paid that national minimum wage. So it's a good thing, right? Now, if you look at it, says what is not a benefit. So usually remember that, don't just mark like that. Read the answer options first. What it says, what is not a benefit. So number 1, it says it boosts the morale of the workers and enhances labor productivity. Now, A is what is not a benefit. So A is a benefit, because higher wages due to higher minimum wage would mean it would improve workers' morale and productivity. B is also something that is correct. It's a benefit, because low paid workers would receive higher incomes, which will improve the living standards of poor people. Option C is also a benefit. It reduces government spending on welfare benefits, because if workers start earning more, fewer workers may need welfare support by the government, which will reduce the government's welfare spending. D is the correct answer, because a national minimum wage is not a solution to structural unemployment, because structural unemployment occurs when there is a mismatch between workers' skills and the skills the employers or the industry needs. Or maybe the jobs entirely disappear because of technological changes or changes in the structure of the economy due to an industry collapse, or the demand for the industry changes structurally. Now, simply raising the minimum wages would not give workers new skills, or it will not solve the occupational or geographical mismatches that exist in the labor markets. But so it's definitely not a benefit, right? It doesn't really reduce structural unemployment. So minimum wages will not solve the structural unemployment issue. That's why question number 11D for David is the correct answer. Question number 12 says an increase in which variable would shift the supply curve for farm workers to the right. The correct answer has to be A for Al. This is a pretty simple question, job security, because the rightward shift in the labor supply would mean that, what does it mean? It simply means that more people are willing and able to work in farming at every wage rate, right? So greater job security like this would make farm work more attractive. So as a result, more people are willing to enter and remain in the occupation, which will increase the labor supply. Pretty simple, okay? All the other answer options actually affect demand. These are the factors that could, this would result into, hourly wage rate would result into, actually, by the way, hourly wage rate would actually result in a movement along the labor supply curve, not the shift. But productivity would affect demand, and more qualifications required would actually end up reducing the supply, okay, and shifting it to the left. So that's incorrect as well. Question number 13 again says, which combination of policies is most likely to reduce the number of low paid workers caught in the poverty trap? Now, for such an MCQ, you must know what a poverty trap is. See, poverty trap is a situation which occurs when a person sort of gains very little extra disposable income from working, because higher incomes are offset by taxes and loss of benefits. So if, let's say, you're not working and you were on government benefits, but now you're working. So dude, I mean, let's say you're earning $10 from government benefits, and by working you're only getting $10.5, and plus, because of $10.5 you're getting, that is taxed as well. So actually you're actually losing instead of gaining. So technically it's so that sort of situation. So the correct answer for this option has to be increase national minimum wage and increase the tax-free allowance, which is option C. Because if you increase the national minimum wage, it raises the workers' earning and increases the reward from employment. So you're actually better off from earning rather than relying on benefits. So you're actually gaining. Also, increasing the tax-free allowance would mean that workers can earn more income before and paying tax. So it's not that you're earning a lot of income and then some of it you're paying in tax. It's not that you're just marginally earning extra income and then a lot of that goes into tax. So getting a tax allowance means an exemption of tax, which will allow you to keep a larger proportion of what you're earning, right? So that is why what makes option C the correct answer. So that would reduce a poverty trap, okay? Especially when you're on the lower end of the spectrum of incomes, right, for lower paid workers. Got it? Now, question number 14 says the diagram represents the demand and supply curve in a competitive industry. What is true about labor L when wages are paid W? Now, before we answer this question, let's revisit what transfer earnings are. Transfer earnings are basically the minimum payment that is required to bring a unit of labor into employment. So all the points technically on the labor supply curve, all these points on your labor supply curve are representing transfer earnings for that particular marginal unit of labor, right? So for the first unit, to bring this dude into employment, you need to pay him, let's say, W1, while for the second, for the third, you need to pay him W2, W3, and W4. Now, is this the market wage rate? No, this is not the market. So this sort of gives you your labor supply curve. But technically, now this is not the market wage rate. The market wage rate could be, let's say, somewhere over here. So let's say this is your, or let's say, yeah, so this is like just a second. For the fifth unit, let's say you need to pay him W5. And so technically this is your market wage rate, because for the fifth unit, you're exactly going to pay him. For the fifth unit, he's willing to work the amount for which the minimum that he's willing to work is exactly go to the market wage rate as well. Now, this was just a very sort of untidy graph, but anyways, so economic rent is so all the points on the labor supply curve are representing the minimum payments that are required to bring somebody into work, which technically means that all points on the supply curve are representing transfer earnings for that particular unit. Now, economic rent, as discussed previously in the video as well for Feb March 26, because this question is usually now being repeated on economic rent transfer earnings in almost every paper. So economic rent is any payment over and above the minimum payment that is required. So any payment over and above the minimum payment required. So if, let's say, let's say you're watching my video right now, right? If I want you to work for me and the minimum that is required to bring you to work is, let's say, $1,000. So that's the minimum. So that's your transfer earnings. Because maybe, and by the way, why is it the minimum required to pay? Why is it the minimum required to bring you into work, to work for me? Because let's say you're already earning $1,000 somewhere else. So if you so technically, if you work for me, that's the opportunity cost. $1,000 is the opportunity cost, basically, because that's you're already earning that. So anything above $1,000, let's say I pay you 1,500, so 500 is the economic rent. Okay. Now, what I was trying to say over here is that if let's say this is your labor demand and supply diagram, and for this first unit of labor, I the minimum that is required to bring him into work is, let's say, a $5, but the market wage rate is $10. So all this vertical distance is representing your economic rent. And for the second unit, the minimum required is how much? The minimum required is, let's say, $7. So this distance, vertical distance, is representing $3, representing the economic rent. For the third unit, the minimum required is $8. This is representing economic rent. And for the fourth unit, right, the minimum required is $10, and you're also, and the market wage is just $10 as well. So there's no economic rent. Okay. Transfer earnings equals to the market wage rate here, so there's no economic rent. Now the point by being is that as you go up the supply curve, you see that the amount of economic rent per worker, is actually falling, right? And the reason why it's falling is because the minimum payment that is required per worker, that is transfer earning, is rising. So since the transfer earnings are rising, like these were representing transfer earnings for every unit of labor, for that particular unit of labor, and these were rising. And I'll give you an intuitive reason why this rises as well, and it would make perfect sense to you. But you see, if you add up all these lines, so this is like a pattern here. So the market is hiring 4 workers, like the industry is hiring, this competitive industry is hiring 4 workers. So if you add all these vertical distances up, right, if you add them up, you get sort of a pattern where, and this pattern is actually representing, we say it as shaded area, but it actually gives like numerous thousands of lines, so it sort of gets we sort of get a pattern here. So this is your economic rent, right? While this area that is under your supply curve is actually representing your transfer earnings, because see, this is transfer earning, right, for the first unit. So this is actually equal to this, right? This is your transfer earning, so it's actually equal to this, which is actually this distance, basically. Similarly, this distance, which is this distance, right? So that is why what you're essentially doing is, this is again giving you a pattern of these various numerous lines. So this is your transfer earnings, right? Got it? Area that is below the supply curve is your transfer earnings, while area below the wage, above the supply, is your economic rent, right? So for the fourth worker, the economic rent is 0 because transfer earning is equal to the wage. And that is exactly the answer to this question as well. What is true about the unit of labor L when wage is paid W? And the answer is D for David, that L is paid exactly the transfer earnings and remains in work. And he remains in work obviously because the minimum that is required to bring him into work is W, and that is paid to him. So he remains his work because because that's a bare minimum for him. So that's okay. He will work for when he's paid the transfer earnings. But anything if he receives extra would be the economic rent. It would be a bonus for him. But obviously, that's the market wage. So the transfer earnings here equal to the market wage. So there's no economic rent. But what we're trying to say is that every point of the labor supply curve, you're learning from this MCQ is that every point of the labor supply curve is actually representing the transfer payments. It's basically the minimum transfer payment is the minimum required payment, right, for that particular unit of labor. So the labor supply curve is essentially showing the labor supply curve, the entire labor supply curve. This labor supply curve is actually showing you the minimum wage that is required to attract additional units of labor into that particular occupation. And you have to understand, guys, that here what you're seeing is that as you go up the supply curve, the transfer earning is rising. That is the minimum amount that is required to bring that unit of labor, every additional unit of labor. So for the first worker that I hire, the minimum that is required for him is, let's say, I don't know, maybe let's say WA. For the second worker, it's what, WB. So why is it that the minimum required payment for each additional worker is going up, right? That is a transfer earning. Why is the transfer earning going up? As you hire additional units of labor. And the best answer that I could give you is that you have to understand that different workers have different next best alternatives, and they also have different willingness to work in that occupation. So let's say that the first worker, this guy here right now, the first workers, I mean, the initial workers who enter that occupation, or the first few workers, or those who enter a job, are usually those who are most suited to it or who have the least attractive alternatives elsewhere. So they're willing to work for relatively low wages. That's why their transfer earnings are low. However, to attract additional workers into the industry, um, to attract additional workers, firms must sort of, persuade people who have, increasingly attractive alternatives, right? So, for example, if I want the third worker, that third worker is sort of already earning a lot somewhere else. So I need to at least pay him, $9 to sort of get him into work for me. That's why. That's why we're saying. So, and this third worker may have another job they like some may, or maybe this third worker is like, what, I sort of value my leisure time more highly, or maybe I have a high paying job somewhere else, or maybe I need to relocate and may, or maybe entering into this industry may require me to sort of relocate into some city or something. So he may require compensation for, or maybe he considers this job as less desirable. So he may require compensation for working in a less desirable occupation that really he doesn't really sort of values. For him, this is like less desirable, maybe. So he requires a high compensation against it. Therefore, each successive unit, that's one way to think about it, but there are many ways. So therefore, each successive unit of labor generally requires a higher minimum payment. That's what you need to know. There could be 1,000 explanations for that. But each successive unit of labor generally requires a higher minimum payment to sort of induce that unit of labor into this particular market or industry, and that minimum payment is the transfer earning. So as a result, the labor supply curve is actually sloping upwards, because the economy must sort of progressively, the economy must offer, or the market must offer, progressively higher wages to attract progressively less willing or more costly workers to recruit. Because the first few workers would be like, they would just immediately jump in. They were like, oh, I love this job, let's go in, and we are willing to work at a lower salary as well. But obviously the market salary is much higher, but they're willing to work at less. So for them, there's huge economic rent involved, right? So that's what we are saying, that as you need, to hire more workers, the market must offer progressively higher wages to attract progressively less willing or more costly to recruit workers. As in, it's not easy to recruit the third guy or the fourth guy. We need to offer, the minimum that we need to offer him is much higher, so the transfer earning is higher. In other words, what we're saying is that the upward slope of the supply curve reflects the fact that, additional workers usually have a higher opportunity cost, because this third worker is actually working somewhere else. He's actually paid a lot more for that particular occupation where he's working, and so you need to pay him at least bare minimum equivalent to what he's working somewhere else. And again, like I said, it reflects the opportunity cost, right? So the upward slope reflects the fact that the additional workers usually have a higher opportunity cost, and transfer earnings are simply like a monetary measure of those opportunity costs. If you're paying if the transfer earnings for the third worker are much higher, let's say $9, it means that that's the bare minimum you need to pay the third worker to bring him into work, which means that he might already be earning $9 somewhere else. So at least pay him what he was earning somewhere else, right? So the opportunity cost for leaving that occupation would be $9 for leaving that job. So that's the bare minimum that you need to pay him, right? Well, the market wage is above 9, so yeah, there's an economic rent involved. But what we're saying is that the transfer earnings are simply, and remember that transfer earnings are simply a monetary measure of these opportunity costs, right? That's why the supply curve is going upwards, right? So, and a useful way to think about it is like, imagine, let's say a school is hiring economic teachers, right? So the first few teachers who might be hired, or who might sort of be willing to work, might happily accept a lower bare minimum wage, right? Now whatever the market wages, whatever the market wages, we're not looking into that, but they might happily accept a smaller wage. For them, the bare minimum to get into work might be less, or the transfer earning might be less. Why? But why? Maybe they love teaching. They love teaching economics. But to attract more teachers, the school may need to, sort of. They need to attract work people away from better paying schools, or maybe people who have corporate careers or consulting jobs to start teaching. So they need to offer them much higher. So those individuals might then require much higher salaries, much higher salaries, or even more before they're actually willing to switch. So their transfer earnings would be higher. Therefore, remember that as you move along the labor supply curve and at higher quantities in this region, always, whether you're here or here, the transfer earnings will be much higher, which is actually the reason why the supply curve is upward sloping as well. So their transfer earnings would be much higher, which is why the supply curve of labor rises upwards. I hope this is clear. So the answer to question number 14 would be D for David. Moving on, question number 15, which says what leads to an inflationary gap. Now, inflationary gap, we all know what it is. It occurs when your aggregate demand is exceeding the economy's, productive potential GDP or productive capacity at full employment. So the economy cannot really produce much more output because resources are already sort of fully employed. So the economy can't produce more sustainably, and that's causing inflation because of excess demand, and that is pushing prices up rather than pushing up real GDP. So real GDP can't increase sustainably, and an increase in real GDP is met by huge increase in prices. So that's an inflationary gap. And in ADS model, this difference is basically known as a positive output gap as well as an inflationary gap. Although in the Keynesian 45-degree AE equals Y model, inflationary gap has a different meaning. It refers to the amount of spending that is required to the amount of spending that needs to go down to bring the economy back to close the positive output gap, the amount of spending that needs to go down by which the spending needs to go down to close down the positive output gap. Anyways, so the correct answer has to be A for alpha. Aggregate demand is greater than the maximum potential output of the economy. 16, an open economy has a positive output gap. So again, a positive output gap. The correct answer, what is likely to be decreasing? Now again, a positive output gap in the ADS model, both these diagrams, this is a positive output gap as well and an inflationary gap as well, right? You can say here an inflationary gap opens up the moment AD shifts outwards. So an economy has a positive output gap, right? So in that context, they're saying what is likely to be decreasing. So we know that what a positive output gap is. Again, it is when the economy is producing more than the economy's long run sustainable output. So what will happen? Workers are producing very heavily. There's overburdening of resources and overutilization of resources. So the demand for labor would be very strong, unreasonably, unsustainably strong. So workers would be likely working very long hours, doing overtime, fewer break, which means they will have very less leisure time, right? They will not have time for themselves or leisure. So leisure time would be falling. So the answer to question number 16 has to be B for boy. What is likely to be decreasing? Leisure time is decreasing. Question 17, in a two-sector economy, autonomous consumer spending increases by 100 billion. Now this sort of a MCQ is always usually on national income statistics. MCQs are coming, so you must be knowing the formula of the multiplier and what is by how much would spending rise on all these sort of. You need to practice these MCQs. So in a two-sector economy, autonomous consumer spending rises by 100, autonomous investment by 200, and marginal propensity to consume is 0.5. What is the increase in national income? So the increase in national income is simply change in Y equals to the multiplier times the change in autonomous spending. So the change in autonomous spending is 300. You need to calculate the multiplier with the formula of 1 over 1 minus MPC. The multiplier is 2, and 300 times 2 would be 600. So this is pretty simple MCQ. I'm sure that appearing students would be aware of the multiplier formula and all of that. Anyways, question number 18 says, which government spending is likely to promote inclusive growth? Now, what is inclusive growth? You must know the definition of what inclusive growth is. Inclusive growth simply means economic growth that benefits a broad range of people, a wide range of people, and it improves the opportunities and the welfare and the living standards across a broad range of people in society. It doesn't really sort of targets a specific sector, or it doesn't really benefits a specific group of people, or it doesn't really benefits a specific sector, but the benefits are shared across all sectors. That's called inclusive growth. So it's not just about growth itself. inclusive means it benefits, everyone benefits from that growth, right? So the answer has to be which policy is least likely to promote inclusive growth, right? So the our first answer, option A, says increasing the national minimum. So if you increase the national minimum wage, this is going to raise the incomes of low paid workers and make the growth more inclusive. So this is not correct. They are saying which is least likely to promote inclusive growth. The second says in investment infrastructure. This again improves access to jobs and economic opportunities for many people. So again, this is going to promote inclusive growth. Option D says using taxes and transfer payments to redistribute income. Again, redistribution would directly help spread the benefits of growth more evenly. So this is incorrect as well, which makes C the correct answer. And C is correct because reducing the power of trade unions is least likely to promote inclusive growth. Why? Because trade unions often help workers negotiate for higher wages and better working conditions or improve job security, right? So weakening those trade unions would reduce the bargaining power of lower paid workers and could increase income inequality. Right, so 18 is C for Charlie. Question number 19 says, what is an example of demand side macroeconomic policy that would reduce cyclical unemployment? Now, the correct answer, again, we all know what demand side policies are that boost spending. We all know what cyclical unemployment is. It's the unemployment that occurs due to deficit spending or due to lack of AD or in a recession. So cyclical unemployment occurs when AD is too low during an economic downturn, right? So the solution is the demand side policy that focuses on increasing AD. So the government would spend on, let's say, in the form of roads, expansionary fiscal policy. So the correct answer is A for alpha, right? So again, this is pretty simple MCQ. This is an expansionary fiscal policy we're talking about here. Question number, if you look at B, the supply side policy. C means cheaper imports may increase imports and hence, cheaper imports, reducing the tax on imports would mean cheaper imports, increase imports and reduce the AD. Because withdrawals would rise, so AD will fall. So this is again going to worsen cyclical unemployment. Increasing indirect taxes again, increasing the rate of tax on goods and services and indirect tax, right? So this would reduce consumption and reduce AD, which will worsen cyclical unemployment. Again, question 20, again a simple question. Question 20 says, the diagram shows two liquidity preference curve, LP1, LP2. So demand for money is shifting outwards, liquidity preference, demand for money. What would cause the liquidity preference curve to shift outwards? The correct answer has to be, boy, there has been a rise in general price level, because you see what is the liquidity preference curve showing? It shows the demand for money at different rates of interest, right? Now, if the general price level rises, people and firms would then need, if there's inflation, the cost of living goes down, the real value of money falls. So people and firms would need more money for transactions because goods and services now cost more. You can't buy the same basket of goods, right? So if, let's say, prices are rising, households need more cash to buy the same basket of goods, and definitely firms also need more money to pay wages and buy inputs. As a result, this increases the transactions demand for money. The transaction demand for money goes up, so liquidity preference shifts to the right from LP1 to LP2. That's why B is correct. Okay, it's pretty simple. Question number 21, again, such a simple question. What does the Phillips curve show? It shows the relationship between inflation and unemployment. I think everyone would mark this correct, and if you are not marking this correct, then that is not good. Okay, 21C, it shows the relationship between inflation rate and the unemployment rate, and we know there's an inverse relation between inflation and unemployment in the short run, as denoted by the short run Phillips curve. Question number 22 says, a government is aiming to increase the role of market forces. Which policy might achieve this? Correct answer is A for alpha, deregulation. Why? Because deregulation means what? It means removing or reducing the government rules and restrictions in the market. And this would sort of increase the role of the market forces, because firms and consumers then would have more freedom to respond to, let's say, price signals or competition. And they would have more freedom. Firms and consumers would have more freedom to respond to not only price signals, but to respond to competition and profit incentives and consumer choices and all of that stuff. So this is what it means when you say encouraging the role of market forces, right? It means giving the firms and consumers more freedom to respond to these price signals, to respond to competition, to respond to profit incentives, to respond to consumer choice. So deregulation is a policy that moves the economy and society closer to market-based systems, right? That's why A is correct. Nationalization is wrong, because nationalization means the government takes ownership of industries. This reduces the role of market forces. This is not correct. Price control is wrong as well, because price control means government directly interfering with prices, reducing the role of market forces. Production quota limits how much firms can production quota limits how much firms can produce. So they are restricting market forces rather than increasing them, because here the government is telling how much to produce. Anyways, question number 23 says, a country has a progressive income tax system. What is not a valid reason for the government's decision to reduce? What is not a valid reason for a government's decision to reduce the rate of income tax paid on high incomes? So, if you're reducing the rate of income tax on people on higher end of the spectrum, so they're saying what is not a valid reason for the government's decision to reduce that rate of income tax, right? Okay, so you have a progressive tax system, which means that the tax burden falls more on the rich rather than on the poor. So the first option says to attract highly skilled workers from abroad. Now, highly skilled workers often, now this is actually a reason. So this would be incorrect, because highly skilled workers, they often compare incomes after taxes across different countries. So lower tax rates on the higher income end of the spectrum, because their income, high skilled workers would have high incomes, right? So lower tax rates on high income workers who are highly skilled can actually attract talented workers in the economy and can increase the country's human capital. So this will be a reason. Maybe the country could use this as a policy, as a supply side labor reforms, or a policy to increase human capital. So this is incorrect. To prevent tax evasion, you see very high tax rates. If the tax rates are very, very high, that encourages some people to hide income or move it abroad, and that sort of evade the taxes. But if you're reducing the tax rates on upper income spectrums, then lower tax rates may reduce such a bad incentive to, or a dirty incentive to move income around to hide it. So again, this is not the answer as well. The question is saying what is not a valid reason why the government is reducing the income tax rates on higher income people, and both of the above options are reasons why the government will end up reducing it, or a valid reason to reduce it. Number 3, C says to provide incentives. Now, you see, if the government is reducing the income tax rates on the upper income groups, which technically means that the government is lowering the marginal tax rate on the higher income spectrum, so it means individuals would keep more of each additional dollar earned now. So if for every additional dollar earned, your disposable income is going to go up, because you will pay less in tax. So this means it's actually encouraging greater effort. The government is technically encouraging more entrepreneurship, and the government is also encouraging labor. The government is also encouraging labor supply. It wants more people to offer themselves for work, and to sort of work in the industry, or to offer themselves for work in the labor markets. So it's encouraging labor supply as well. So to provide work incentives could be an option, could be a valid reason why the government reduces the marginal tax rates on upper income groups. Hence, this is incorrect. So we are left with D only, and D is correct because the question is asking for what is not a valid reason, right? And if the government sort of cuts the tax rates on high income individuals, then those individuals may keep a larger proportion of their income with themselves in their pockets. Now, this would generally increase income inequality, because you're making the rich more richer. So this generally increases the income inequality rather than reducing it. So therefore, reducing the income tax on high income earners is unlikely to be a policy which will be aimed at reducing income inequality. Hence, that is what makes it the right answer. Question number 24, a political party proposed a policy of quantitative easing, the creation of money by the central bank. Okay, now quantitative easing is used when your traditional monetary policy fails, usually in a liquidity trap. When traditional monetary policy fails, so what would such a policy be? When would such a policy be least likely to destabilize the macroeconomy? So in other words, they're saying when would quantitative easing least likely fail? So when would it least likely fail? When would it not fail? We know what you see, you must know what quantitative easing is. So quantitative, when you talk about quantitative easing is basically an expansionary monetary policy and the government uses a liquidity trap where traditional monetary policy fails when your interest rates are too low but they're no longer effective. When normal interest rate cuts, when normal interest rate cuts are not effective. So what the central bank does is the central bank creates new money electronically, and it uses that electronic money to buy government bonds from banks, and it credits the banks with that money, and that sort of creates new reserves with the banking system. So it increases the amount of money in the banking system, and as a result what happens is that it's crediting the bank with that newly created central bank's money, and as a result commercial banks end up holding higher reserves now, and as a result you are directly creating new bank reserves, which means that these extra reserves can make it easier for banks to expand lending if they end up finding credit-worthy borrowers and if these banks are willing to lend. So if banks then make more loans, then the fractional reserve banking system will kick in, and that can create additional deposits, and the credit creation process starts, so money supply expands. So technically quantitative easing is expanding the money supply simply, but in a non-traditional way when your traditional monetary policy fails, and it's usually imposed in a liquidity trap situation, and there are some other policies as well, like helicopter money and all of that. Let's not go into all these details, but yeah. Now coming to the question, this 24, what exactly would be the answer for this? The first option says when the economy was experiencing a high level of inflation. So if the economy is experiencing a high level of inflation, then it means that the economy is already very near full capacity. Then the economy is already at full capacity or nearing full capacity or just at full capacity. And if it creates new money through expansion quantitative easing, it will create further inflation. So the question is saying, when would such a policy be least likely to destabilize, or when would quantitative easing least likely fail? So in this situation it would fail because it will create more inflation. So that's a problem here, because quantitative easing would add further inflationary pressures and it could destabilize the economy. But here in the MCQ we want to find out when would quantitative easing least likely destabilize, or in other words, when would quantitative easing not fail. So here it will fail because it will just create more inflation, it will create more problems. Option B says price stability with full employment. So the economy is nearing full capacity and extra demand is again when the economy had price stability but there was full employment of the labor force. So if the economy is nearing full capacity and extra demand, again, option A and B, again, it's pretty much looks similar. And when the economy had price stability but there was full employment of the labor force, right? So it means the economy is at full capacity, and again, excess spending or demand due to money supply increasing would create more inflation. So again, this will destabilize the economy. Full employment with current account, option D says when there was full employment and a current account balance of payment deficit. The thing is that if you do quantitative easing here, when you have full employment and you have a current account balance of payment deficit, so quantitative easing would increase spending and imports, because when you do quantitative easing, national income would rise and that would increase incomes, and again it would mean more imports as well, because higher national incomes increase imports as well, because spending goes up, so more withdrawals go up as well. So that would worsen the current account deficit, and it would cause further inflationary pressure as well because of higher AD caused due to increasing money supply. So again, such a policy will destabilize the macroeconomy. Here if you see, the inflation objective is worsening. Here also the inflation objective is worsening. Here the inflation objective is worsening. Moreover, the BOP deficit objective is worsening as well. BOP is going into a further deficit. C is the correct answer, and the reason why C is the correct answer is because it says when there was a deep recession with high levels of unemployment. That is exactly when quantitative easing works properly, and that is exactly where quantitative easing is imposed in such situation, in a liquidity trap, in a deep recession, because this policy of quantitative easing is least likely to destabilize the economy when you have huge levels of spare capacity. Because in a deep recession, unemployment is very high, factories are underutilized, and aggregate demand is excessively weak. Therefore, when you increase spending through quantitative easing, that is likely to raise the output and employment rather than cause inflation. So it won't destabilize the economy. It will actually make the economy more stable. It will increase employment and national income without creating inflation. That is why 24C is the correct answer. Right? So quantitative easing is most appropriate when AD is too low and you have spare capacity, and quantitative easing would become very risky or problematic when the economy is already close to or at full employment, because it will just create more inflation. So Got it. So I hope this is now correct. Question number 20. This is now understood. Question number 25 says, what does a Laffer curve show? Laffer curve by Arthur Laffer. I already have a video, by the way, on Laffer curve. Now it shows the relationship between tax rate and tax revenues, and increasing the Arthur Laffer said that increasing tax rate increases tax revenue, but only up to a certain point, and T is the efficient tax rate. And beyond that tax rate, if you further increase the tax rate, your tax revenues goes down. If you increase the tax rate below the efficient tax rate, tax revenues goes up. But after the efficient tax rate, if you increase the tax rate further, Arthur Laffer said, the tax revenues goes down. And I already have a video on it as well. I've explained all the reasons in that video. You can check it out on my channel. 25 says, option 25 is A, the amount of tax revenue received at each tax rate. That's what the Laffer curve is showing. Then you have the Kuznets curve as well, and the Kuznets curve shows in 26, it shows the relationship between economic growth, that is real GDP per capita, simple income per capita, and and income inequality. And Simon Kuznets, he said that initially when economies become developed, they start developing, and they become, as they grow and as the income per capita and GDP rises, income inequality worsens. But after a certain time, after as the economy begins to develop, inequality would initially rise, and the reason what he gave was that some sectors benefit and some regions grow faster than others. That is what makes inequality rise, because not all sectors and regions would benefit equally. But as development continues further, as incomes per capita start growing more and more and more, as you start moving away from the origin, and as the incomes go on increasing measured on the horizontal axis, more people benefit from growth, and your education would expand, and government would also redistribute incomes, and that government redistribution would also rise, and that would cause inequality to fall. So that is why you have a typical famous inverted U-shaped curve, that is the Kuznets curve. So if you look at option A is actually describing the Lorenz curve, not the Kuznets curve. So the correct answer for question number 26 has to be measure of income inequality and income per capita. Question number 27, what might cause income inequality to... Oh, by the way, I also have the video on Kuznets curve on my channel. You can check it out as well. Question number 27, what might cause income inequality to worsen in a country? Okay, this is a simple question. The answer has to be A for alpha, increased discrimination. Reason being because income inequality... By the way, when does income inequality worsen? It worsens when certain groups face... especially with respect to option A I'm talking about, it would worsen when certain groups would face discrimination in employment. They would face discrimination in promotions. They would face discrimination in education. They would face discrimination in payments. They would face discrimination in jobs. They would face discrimination in salaries. So again, option A is correct. So discrimination based on gender, ethnicity, religion, age, or whatever kind of discrimination, it can prevent the individuals from accessing high-paying jobs and opportunities, and this sort of widens income inequality and income differences across societies. Remember that. 25, increased labor market participation is wrong, because if workers become more skilled overall, and increase labor market participation is wrong, because if people enter more employment, labor force participation rises, and household incomes would generally rise, and inequality will decrease, not increase. Increased skill level of the workers is also wrong, because if workers become more skilled, productivity and earning potential would rise, and this would be simultaneously be associated with higher incomes and improved opportunities. So income inequality will fall, not worsen. Increased welfare payments would again redistribute incomes towards lower income households, and therefore tend to reduce income inequality, not increase. Question number 28, a multinational company is planning to invest in a new factory in a low income country. What is not a possible benefit? So what is not a benefit, right? So see, what is not a benefit? So if you look at option A, acquiring improved technology. Now, technology transfer is one of the most important benefits of FDI, by the way. We have studied this in paper 4 as well. So no, this is incorrect. Better training of the workforce. Workers would often gain valuable skills and experience because of FDI, multinationals. So again, this thing is not a benefit. So both A and B are benefits. Extra tax revenue for the government. The government may collect huge amounts of corporate tax and income tax revenues from workers and firms' profit. So this is, you're left with D. And our answer option D says increased competition for small business producers. Actually, increased competition for small domestic firms it is a possible benefit to consumers, you can say, because of they may reduce prices, but they're asking you to the country itself, especially a low income country. So it's not considered a benefit to the low income country. In fact, it's considered a cost, not a benefit, because local firms, especially small domestic firms, may struggle to compete with multinational superior technology and multinational scales, and the scale at which the MNCs may operate and its established brand, and they may have a lot of financial resources. So domestic firms may lose market share or may even close down. So again, that's a problem. It's 28, David. 29, a country with a fixed exchange rate faces a surplus on the current account. Now, we all know what a fixed exchange rate is. A country that has a fixed exchange rate and plus it also has a current account surplus means that because of a current account surplus, there is exports are more than imports, which means that demand for the currency is more than supply of the currency, which means an higher demand for currency is putting up upward pressure on the exchange rate and the currency, and because of foreign demand for its exports is so strong. But since it has a fixed exchange rate system, it needs to maintain that currency value. So sort of the demand for the currency is going up, but it needs to increase the supply of the currency. Demand for the currency is going up. It needs to increase the supply of the currency to maintain that value, right? To maintain that exchange rate value. And one of the ways in which it could do that is through expansionary monetary policy, which would involve reducing the interest rates, because when interest rates would go down, foreign financial investors would be less attracted to investing. There would be hot money outflows, you can say. So reducing interest rate would result in hot money outflows would result in increasing the supply of domestic currency. Increasing the supply of domestic currency would put downward pressure on the exchange rate. So the upward pressure on the exchange rate due to higher demand would be offset by the downward pressure on the exchange rate due to artificially increasing the supply of the currency by reducing interest rates, which is an expansionary monetary policy. A is incorrect. Increasing subsidies given to exporters is incorrect, because if you increase subsidy given to exporters, this would encourage even more exports and make the current account surplus larger, which will increase the upward pressure on the currency. Not, we want to reduce the exchange. We want to bring the value of the currency down. Okay. Impose import barriers. This would again reduce the imports and further increase the current account surplus. Again, it would cause the appreciating pressure on the currency. Option C says the sale of foreign currencies in the forex market. This is incorrect, because in order to maintain if you want to bring the exchange rate down, you either reduce the interest rates or you sort of buy foreign currencies. You buy foreign currencies in the forex market. You use the domestic currency to buy the foreign currency. So to maintain a fixed exchange rate with a surplus, the central bank would normally buy foreign currency and sell domestic currency to increase the supply of domestic currency in the forex market artificially. Selling foreign currency, but the option is saying selling foreign currency. Selling foreign currency would move in the wrong direction. Selling foreign currency would actually increase the demand for the domestic currency and would further put up upward pressure on the exchange rate. Got it? That is why David is the correct answer. Question number 30, which criticism of FDI is least valid? We all know what FDI is, foreign direct. So option A is the correct answer, because it says it encourages competition. Oh, by the way, let's look at why B, C, and D are incorrect. For question number 30, if you look at option number B, it says it brings workers. Option B, it brings workers from its own country and provides only low-paying jobs to local workers. Now, this is a criticism, and it's a valid criticism of FDI. This is actually a disadvantage that we teach in paper 4 for FDI, which is actually, so it's saying which criticism is least valid. It's a valid criticism, so it's incorrect. We have to find out the least valid criticism. So it is option C says it is usually withdrawn quickly in the case of global crisis, making developing countries vulnerable. This is again a valid criticism. Why? Because usually what happens is that multinational firms can actually reduce the investment plans or close factories and move out or relocate production during major economic shocks or recessions going on in developing economies, because developing countries are sort of have unstable economic conditions. So developing countries may hence be exposed to, developing countries are, if developing, so the point is that it just, developing countries are exposed to these international economic shocks, and hence FDI might be withdrawn from there. So this is again a valid criticism. It makes these developing countries very vulnerable then. So it's a valid criticism, right? So this is not the right answer. Option D says its actions often result in environmental degradation. Again, this is a valid criticism because FDI could result in environmental problems and damages like deforestation, they could excessively mine, pollution, depletion of natural resources, all valid criticisms. So multinational firms may exploit weaker environment. I mean, usually multinational companies, they do that. They exploit weaker environmental regulations because developing countries have weaker environmental regulations. So this is a valid criticism. Option A, by the way, is not a criticism at all. It's a benefit. Option A, if you look at option A, it's a benefit because when foreign firms enter a country, they often increase competition. They increase competition. Increased competition can reduce prices for consumers, improve product quality, encourage innovation. It may force the inefficient domestic firms to become more productive and efficient. So this will improve economic efficiency in that country and improve consumer welfare. So this is not a strong criticism of FDI. So this is the correct answer. In fact, this is not a criticism at all. It's a benefit. Hence, that is why this is the correct answer. So yeah, you have to understand that Cambridge wants you to recognize that option A is not really a criticism at all. It describes the positive effects of competition and efficiency. That is why it's the correct answer. So which criticism is least valid? Well, if something is a benefit, that's equivalent to saying that it's the least valid criticism. Or you can say it's a negative criticism. A negative criticism equals a benefit. Again, so think it that way. So question number 30, option A is the correct answer. And with that, we also finished the paper. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'll see you all in the next video. Until then, take care.